Hi, my name is Laura Welp, and I work for Western Watersheds Project, which is a conservation group working for better livestock management on public lands. I am here today to talk to you about grazing permit renewals in theory and in practice. First, though, I'd like to thank my colleagues Melissa Kane and Josh Osher. A lot of the material from this talk comes from a story map that they put together. This is it right here. And this is Melissa's map, in fact, and it shows the 22,000 grazing allotments on BLM land. Together, they make up about 155 million acres of land that's managed for grazing by the BLM. And each allotment is associated with a permit that's usually issued for 10 years. And this permit prescribes things like what kinds of livestock can be on the allotment, how many and for how long. And at the end of the permit period, before the permit expires, the BLM goes out and it assesses the basic ecological functioning of the allotment, and that's hydrology, soils, and vegetation. And they see if it's meeting rangeland health standards, and if it's not, is it due to livestock grazing, and are there changes in livestock management needed that would allow the allotment and the ecological functioning to meet rangeland health standards. So they take that information and they prepare an environmental assessment, or an EA, and they send this out to the public for review. And this allows for transparency, and it allows the public to know what BLM is doing, and if they have any information or thoughts about that allotment, they can give that to the BLM. And that, in the end results in a better permit renewal process. That's the theory anyway. In practice, though, the BLM doesn't have the staff to do all of that NEPA and assessing. So it wasn't getting done, and the BLM had built up a large backlog of unassessed allotments without EAs. So Congress in 2004 allowed the BLM a year in which they could administratively renew these permits without environmental review or public input. And the intent was for BLM to take that time and use it to try to catch up with this backlog. But 1 year wasn't enough, and so they did it for another year and then another year. And then eventually Congress just, in 2014, made these administrative permit renewals permanent by amending one of the bedrock land management laws, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. But this only applied to permits that were not going to have any changes in terms and conditions. And Congress still intended BLM to work on reducing the backlog that requiring NEPA analysis and land health evaluations. Of course, we can predict what the unintended consequences of that policy were going to be. Before FLPMA was amended to enshrine the workaround, 28% of allotments were renewed with no NEPA analysis or public notification. In 2017, just 4 years later, 38% of allotments were renewed without NEPA analysis. And then by 2021, we see that 54% of allotments are authorized without any NEPA analysis. And many allotments have actually been renewed more than once using this workaround. And this allows current grazing management, good or bad, to continue without land health evaluations or any opportunity for public review for 2 decades or more. This also applies to BLM lands with more protective designations like wilderness areas, monuments, and designations that are supposed to prioritize resource protection. And we see this with examples from the Bears Ears National Monument that we see on the right and the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument that's on the left here. If you overlay the map of allotments without NEPA for 2 cycles or more, and you overlay that on top of the monuments, you see that none of the monument allotments have had EAs completed for 20 years or more. And this matters because we are in a period of transition in monument management plans between the Trump and Biden administrations right now. MMP guidance for grazing does not take effect until site-specific NEPA is done to implement prescriptions in the plan. So any grazing management prescribed in the new Biden monument management plan won't take effect on the ground until NEPA is done for a permit renewal. There are 40 Grand Staircase National Monument allotments that are expiring in 2022 or 2023. This is likely before a new MMP can be finalized. So they are still under the old Trump plan, even when the allotments contain important habitat for at-risk wildlife and plants that are known to be negatively impacted by current livestock grazing. So if these 40 allotments are renewed again administratively this year or next, there may be no NEPA or opportunity for public input for 10 more years. And this is a problem westwide because many of those allotments are not meeting rangeland health standards, and it's due to livestock. 65% of the allotments that aren't meeting are being rubber stamped nonetheless for renewal without any environmental analysis or changes to management. They're being renewed administratively. This doesn't mean the BLM and the rancher aren't informally going out and assessing conditions, but it's without public input. And also the problems and the solutions that they come up with are never addressed by reduction of stocking rate or lower utilization. There are two predominant choices to fixing poor conditions, it seems: more vegetation treatments or more water sources. Here's an example of a vegetation treatment project from the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in the Circle Cliffs allotment. I worked at the monument in 2002, and we did an assessment on this semi-desert loam Wyoming big sagebrush ecological site. And first of all, we noticed that we don't see any living sagebrush on this site, and that's always a tell about condition. We also see a lack of plant species diversity, and the only functional group is non-native annual forbs. In fact, those yellow stalks sticking up are tumble mustard, and there's also cheatgrass and Russian thistle. There's no biological soil crust, and there's a high percentage of bare ground and lots of erosion. So this did not pass standards for rangeland health. And why does it look like this? Well, this place was treated probably in the 50s or 60s and probably with non-native crested wheatgrass. So it's a monoculture. And seedings like this, they tend to concentrate livestock and wildlife. So there's a lot of trampling and heavy grazing use. And I know that there's also a history of trespass on this particular allotment. So over the years, land health had declined to the point that it just didn't have the resistance or resilience it needed when the drought came along in 2002. Notably, nearby untreated sites did not die. And so here's the same ecological site, only it's up the road a bit in Capitol Reef National Park, and it's ungrazed. And we can see that it has far more diversity of trees and shrubs and wildflowers as healthier soils. So this is the kind of reference state, the kind of thing we want to get back to. So what did the BLM do to fix this? They decided to put in another seeding. So in 2007, they seeded this area with 50% non-natives, forage species, and 50% natives, even though the Monument Management Plan prescribed that they only use native seeds in all revegetation projects. So I revisited this site in 2012, and so far, wow, it looks like we did get some response until you realize, well, this is just crested wheatgrass. And this litter that's on the site that appears to be being protective is actually from cheatgrass. So it's going to blow away and not really help us out a lot with keeping soil on the site and reducing erosion. So this is really not an ideal outcome yet. And pay attention to this arrow right here. We're going to see that in the next slide. I went back again in 2019, just 7 years later, and we see that the treatment has failed. It lasted 12 years or less, and it costed probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. Often drought is blamed for a complete die-off like this, but BLM is supposed to manage for drought to prevent the outcomes like this on their seedings. And I did see fresh cow pies when I was out there, and a week or two after the off date, so it appears that trespass problems are ongoing still. Now, this grazing permit was renewed administratively in 2013, so there was no NEPA conducted. And if it's renewed again in 2023, when it expires, there may not be an opportunity for public input or a change in grazing management for another 10 years. The other management action that is commonly proposed to fix livestock grazing problems are installing new water sources. For example, when livestock are hanging around troughs and impacting an area too much, then the proposal is to construct new water sources farther away. And the idea is that this will draw the cattle away from the degraded sites and more toward the ungrazed areas. But often in practice, that just results in continued degradation around the original site and new degradation around the new project area. Also, pumping wells especially risks dewatering water sources elsewhere, like springs and seeps that might be important to wildlife or to indigenous people. The map here shows Bears Ears National Monument and the over 40 wells and reservoirs that are proposed there. Just this year, they're trying to get these in before a new management plan can take effect. That might limit the installation of these new features that cause a lot of surface disturbance and potentially can affect the hydrology. So there are EAs for these projects for public comment, but they don't analyze the effects of livestock grazing very much. And that's the whole purpose of these projects. And as we showed, before, none of these allotments have had NEPA in two cycles. So there's been no opportunity for the public to comment on livestock grazing on any of these allotments. So updated land health assessments are also important to the Biden administration's America the Beautiful, or 30 by 30 initiative that sets aside 30% of lands in the U.S. by 2030 to conserve biodiversity and address the climate challenge. But the administration is suggesting that active grazing lands can be included as conservation lands. And as we've seen, the health of much of that land has not been assessed. So this is another unintended consequence of the lack of land health assessments. It's not knowing which lands are healthy and which are not. And as we have seen previously, even the lands with increased protections in BLM monuments or wilderness areas are not always healthy. And Western Watershed Project's own Deputy Director Greta Anderson has said that the Bureau and Forest Service actually have no idea what the land health status is on the majority of public land allotments because they haven't ever looked. And where the Bureau has looked, fully a third of Bureau lands are failing land health standards because of livestock grazing. Counting lands that aren't meeting even the minimum standards of ecological resilience defeats the purpose of 30 by 30's goals to address the biodiversity crisis. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing is to update the Taylor Grazing Act. This was adopted in 1934 in response to widespread damage from unregulated livestock. It created the allotment system, for example. But it also said that any land not suitable for crops or higher uses could then be suitable for grazing. And the BLM interprets this to mean that all lands not reserved for other uses must be grazed. So they can't permanently remove livestock from an allotment solely for conservation or ecological integrity. So the act needs to be updated to reflect those values. We also could allow for the permanent retirement of grazing permits for conservation. Right now, you can buy out a permit and retire it for the term of its permit, but it's not permanent. Once the permit expires, it must be offered to another permittee. There is an act in Congress that's been introduced, the Voluntary Grazing Permit Retirement Act, that would provide for this. And it's one of the best ways of reconciling the conflict between ecosystem sustainability and grazing. We could also implement better accountability measures, because right now there's really no accountability to ensure compliance with grazing regulations or agency policies. So if an allotment is not meeting land health standards, it's not viewed as poor performance. Or, for example, if a vegetation treatment is not managed properly and it dies, there really are no consequences for that. And in fact, budgets are decided by how many acres are treated in the past year. And the more acres treated, the more money the BLM office gets the next year. So we need to disincentivize these production-based goals and promote conservation goals, especially on BLM national monuments, wilderness areas, and other lands with special designations. Another thing we could do is use science-based management. This seems self-evident, but agency staff and indeed the general public see science as just another point of view, and a liberal one at that. So agency staff needs to understand and apply science more rigorously. We can also start doing NEPA again. The agency sometimes downplays the importance of land health assessments, saying that they go out every year anyway with the permittee and discuss what should be done to protect resources. But the results of that discussion are not shared with the public, and so that lacks transparency. And further, both of the parties are potentially influenced by financial or cultural interests to promote ranching. The rancher obviously has cultural, social, and financial interests in maximizing grazing, but the BLM range staff often also have social and cultural interests in perpetuating ranching and perhaps a political interest in keeping their jobs. So relying on an opaque process like that, an informal one like that, does not lead to the best management decisions, and it violates the spirit of NEPA. We need to restart the formal NEPA process, conduct land health assessments, and allow for public input with EAs. And to do that, we really need to give the BLM more money to do their job. The conditions on the public lands are declining, and the Government Accountability Office has issued a report on livestock grazing, and they've concluded that the BLM is not able to protect and restore lands with the current funding and staff. And they said that Congress should either give BLM more money or limit grazing. And this resonated with me because I worked at the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument on a livestock management plan. I saw that conditions were poor in some places, and I suggested that we reduce utilization or stocking rates or, limit grazing in some other way and improve conditions. And the range staff said that that would not be possible because the permittees would not allow that. It would not be financially possible. So I thought to myself, well, that means, when the grazing plan is finally written, we would conclude that we couldn't have grazing, at least not at current levels. I thought that if BLM can't do grazing right, there can't be grazing, right? Instead, with this administrative renewal process, Congress has said, BLM, we won't give you enough money to do your job, so we'll just make it so you don't have to do it. And we need to give them more money or retire more grazing allotments. And finally, I'd like to thank Melissa and Josh again. Melissa made a lot of the maps that you see in this presentation, and they have some nice story maps that you should look at if you're interested in this issue. Thanks for your time.